Well, good afternoon. This is an interesting and timely topic. You can't watch the news or read the headlines without seeing something about U.S. trade relations these days. And if you're like me, you wonder, how does that impact me, or how does that impact Illinois? And did a little bit of research, and I'm hoping not to steal the thunder from our guest speaker, but I was surprised to learn that Illinois has over $65 billion worth of exports around the world, of which $17 billion is going to Canada. Canada is actually our largest trading partner with the state of Illinois, and reciprocally, Illinois is the second largest market for Canadian goods in the U.S. So it's definitely something that is impactful, it's significant, and it's a dynamic relationship. And we're fortunate to have Mr. John Cruickshank, the Consul General of Canada, here to shed some light on that relationship and perhaps highlight for us some of the opportunities and the challenges in the current environment. So I'm going to turn it right over to Consul General.
Thank you, Nancy.
Thank you.
Well, thank you for the opportunity to be here today. Greetings from the Government of Canada and from Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. I hold the memory of Adlai Stevenson in very high regard, and it's an honor to have the chance to offer some thoughts to friends and supporters of the Centre. Now, this was billed as remarks about U.S.-Canada relations, and I have a couple of things to say. But frankly, I thought it would be a little more entertaining for both of us, and perhaps more to your concern with democratic institutions, if I actually gave you some musings about something that I know rather more about than diplomacy, and that is about the media. As some of you know, I am actually a late career diplomat. I have spent most of the last 40 years of my life in the news business. And in that time, I wrote news stories, columns, and editorials. I ran newspaper, television, radio, and online newsrooms. I served as editor and then publisher here with the Chicago Sun-Times between 2000 and 2008. And at the time that I retired from journalism into diplomacy, I was the publisher of the Toronto Star, Canada's largest newspaper, co-chairman of the Canadian Press, the National Wire Service, and chairman of the Canadian Journalism Foundation. As a journalist, I interviewed Mikhail Gorbachev just after he was ousted from office. I co-authored a column on refugees with the Dalai Lama, and I stood one day in the East Bank Club change room, clad only in a towel, trying to explain to an exasperated presidential hopeful from the South Side of Chicago why I couldn't and wouldn't stop Lynn Sweet from badgering him. I also got to know a young Justin Trudeau, whose father I had covered as a reporter, covered with a mixture of trepidation and awe. And by the time I was ready to retire from journalism, Justin had become the second Prime Minister Trudeau, and he asked me to represent Canada here as Consul General in Illinois, Wisconsin, Missouri, and that strip of Indiana that you can see from the top of the Trump Tower on a clear day. The Trump Tower, some of you will remember, is actually where my office was. We sold that building to... We'll leave that for question period.
Early 2017.
I will confess to you that I still miss the thrill of working in a newsroom every day. The energy, the camaraderie, the immense daily challenge to inform audiences accurately and responsibly, and the deep sense of public purpose. It's unlike almost any other business. But this is a very difficult hour for journalism. We're in the midst of a convulsive technological revolution. It's disrupting everything we do and has deep implications for both our public and our private lives. The news media especially is undergoing what the Austrian economist Joseph Schumpeter called creative destruction. Some large national institutions are coping reasonably well, at least for now. The New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, CNN, Fox News, among a select few. But most regional and local television and news operations are struggling. They've lost a significant share of their audience and their revenue to new media, and almost none of which employs reporters or editors. Facebook and YouTube have mastered the secret of audience creation with all the financial rewards that come with it, without incurring any of the costs of content creation. Almost 2,000 American newspapers have closed in the last 15 years. Staffing in newsrooms across the country has shrunk by 25% in the last 10 years. During most of my career, we generally had adequate budgets to maintain thriving bureaus at city halls and state houses, to hire investigative reporters, who allow beat reporters to become specialists in the coverage of health and education and the environment and government. We even had money left over for weekend feature writers, film, TV, symphony, ballet reviewers, and we had space to print it. One of the curious elements about our present circumstance is that while many of those specialties are now gone, people complain that there's too much news. Few seem to register just how much has disappeared. I speak qualitatively rather than quantitatively, because being offered the same thing on multiple platforms is not the same as having too much to absorb. We've lost, thank you. I thought I was in a like-minded crowd. We've lost a portion of the contextual and explanatory writing that was done by reporters and columnists who had spent years developing their knowledge, their contacts, and their judgment. The softer features, routine stories from school boards and city and state politics, and much of the very local reporting about daily life in our cities and our towns, is just no longer being produced. What remains, then, is a higher proportion of harder news stories about crime, disaster, wild weather, political discord, everything that went wrong yesterday. The news agenda portrays a world that is darker, less diverse, and less colorful than it was in the depiction of earlier days. Now, when I talked about news impoverishment, I mean of the entire industry. While newspapers were surpassed by TV as prime influencers of the public many decades ago, the daily news file has always been driven by print reporters. So when print journalism loses its resources, it's a loss for everybody. And there is no sign that it will stop. Newspapers have latterly suffered an enormous decline in relevance with the public. 5 years ago, almost half of all Americans cited newspapers as one of their news sources. Today, that number is just 19%, according to the 2019 Reuters Institute Digital News Report, which was just issued last week. TV news has fared better until now, but it is facing a demographic cliff. On average, middle-aged and older Americans, our group, spend about an hour a day on TV news. Today's under 40s in America spend on average 12 minutes a day. So have you ever wondered when you're watching CNN or another one of the 24-hour news channels why all the advertisements are for walk-in bathtubs? Right? Denture adhesives, arthritis cures. Yeah. Well, it tells you who's watching. 5 years ago, 3/4 of Americans cited TV as one of their news sources. Today it's 58%. It is continuing to decline. So there are three big headlines that jump out for me in our present circumstances. First, the business model for print and regional and network TV is breaking down. Not just here. With varying speed and intensity, this is happening everywhere in the digitalized world. It's happening here first and fastest because America is the center of technological innovation and because the English language market is the most competitive anywhere. Second, only a few national and international titles are making a business success of selling digital subscriptions. Here and globally, it is evolving as a winner-take-all business. A relatively high 16% of Americans pay for a digital news subscription. It's only 9% in Canada. But the New York Times and the Washington Post alone make up half the total. So for most of the legacy media, there is no easy transition onto another platform. And third, millennials and younger age cohorts are, on average, consuming much less news than their parents, and they're consuming it very differently. They are about 1/3 as likely as older Americans to say they follow the news all or most of the time. We already know younger people, for the most part, don't read newspapers. But according to the Nielsen Media Measurement Company, they aren't big TV or digital news consumers either. They spend less than a third the time with TV and digital news that their parents do. Younger people, by contrast, are driving the use of social media as a news platform. More Americans now say they use social media as a source for news than say they use newspapers. This is a profound change, and it's only beginning to get the attention that it really deserves, because it raises enormous questions about who will support reporting in the future and about where people will be able to go for authoritative journalism. To date, social media platforms have done little or nothing to support the creation of the news stories that benefit them, nor have they demonstrated an ability to vet effectively the material that presents itself as news on those platforms. About 2/3 of Americans now, and the number is constantly rising, about 2/3 of Americans now use social media some of the time for news. 60% of that group say they don't believe what they're reading on social media. In fact, 40% of the people who say they prefer to get their news on social media say they don't believe it. Go figure. This can't but help contribute to the more generalized decline in trust in institutions that has shaken America over the last decade and become much more intense in the last couple of years. Americans are far more critical and suspicious of their media than Canadians, or indeed than virtually all of the other countries studied by the Reuters Institute. Of 38 nations, the US was the 6th most distrustful. The Canadians, the 5th most confident. 66% of Americans are concerned that their daily news is tainted by misinformation and disinformation. More than 40% say they actually avoid the news. In Canada, the number is about 29%. American conservatives are by far the most disenchanted. Only 9% of conservatives trust what they read or watch. Only 8% believe the media takes the right tone in its reporting. While most progressives say the media helps them understand the world around them, conservatives disagree. Almost half of progressives say the media picks relevant stories. Only 20% of conservatives concur. A large majority of Republicans have told the Quinnipiac pollsters the last 2 years running that they regard the news media as an enemy of the American people rather than an important part of its democracy. This points to an extraordinary degree of polarization in the US population and in the media. But you hardly need me to tell you that. But I can speculate a little bit about the impact of the business challenges on news coverage. When business is as tough as it is now in news operations become very anxious to be reflective of their audiences. They are reluctant to lead, anxious to follow. In politics, you would call this cozying up to your base. At the local level, this really isn't a huge problem, right? The worst consequence is frankly a tendency to boosterism. But national brands that cover the big political and economic stories of the day tend to be drawn from the center by their audiences, by the audiences they choose and the audiences that choose them. So newspapers from New York and Washington gravitate left, unless, of course, they're business publications, in which case they drift to the right. The news reporting remains itself, for the most part, straight down the middle. But the news agenda, what gets covered, what gets given prominence, is influenced by what audiences and the advertisers those audiences attract are most interested in. Talk television stations, meanwhile, they simply double down on the orientation of the majority of their viewers to communicate like-mindedness with their audiences. As a consequence, the most reliable predictor for how a national media outlet will treat a news story about, say, refugees or immigrants is the ideological leaning of its audiences. Right? Fox News is scandalized by the sovereignty crisis at the southern border. CNN is appalled that children are being separated from refugee families. The Washington Times decries the lawlessness of immigrants, and the Washington Post documents their positive impact on economic growth. I oversimplified to make a point. The polarization in audiences and news agendas is real. It's probably why Americans trust their local TV news more than they do their national media. because they don't perceive an ideological basis at the local level. In Canada, where the population is, at least at this point, not quite as polarized, the national media score by far highest. I know I've thrown a lot of numbers at you. If you're interested in exploring them for yourselves, I've been referring to the 2019 Reuters Institute Digital News Report, the Nielsen Company's 2018 Millennials Report, and the Pew Research Center's 2018 look at news use across social media platforms. So what lies ahead? It's very difficult to see from here. For news media businesses, the technological and financial challenges are only going to grow. We are still a long way from a new normal. The rapid emergence of successful new forms and formats for news is made less likely by the present state of audience fragmentation and political polarization. In the meantime, philanthropically supported organizations like ProPublica are helping keep investigative reporting alive. My old newspaper, the Chicago Sun-Times, right now is supported in part by organized labor. And elite publications are benefiting from a flight to news quality. In Canada, the Trudeau government has expressed concern about the media's news challenges. In the words of a recent announcement, the government of Canada understands that for a democracy to function properly, it needs to have a solid independent news media. And the government has pledged almost $600 million over 5 years to support news reporting. The money will be distributed by an arm's-length agency. The Canadian government has also partnered with Great Britain this summer for a forum on freedom of the press they hope will spark international action to address the rising toll of death and imprisonment that journalists are facing around the world. And while all such measures are met by a studied cynicism in some media quarters, most in the Canadian media are grateful for the show of concern and quietly pleased by the acknowledgement north of the border that in a democracy, the health of the news media matters. Thank you.